All right. Thank you everybody for coming today. I really appreciate it. It's 6:02 and I feel like we should be ready to, I'm admitting one last person. Apparently we have one or two people who are late. Um, let's take this show on the road. Awesome. So welcome everyone. My name is Danny Ramadan. I am the Syrian Canadian author, the Syrian Canadian author. I'm a Syrian Canadian author and public speaker and LGBTQ refugees activist. And welcome to my monthly series, I Have Been Wondering. I Have Been Wondering is a series that I do here in my home, right out of my office in Vancouver. And the goal of this series is to connect between somebody like myself, a person of color, a queer person, writing on the margins, with someone else who identify within, also another writer who identify within, be it the people of color community, be it the LGBTQ community, or the intersections of whatever that is. Today's event is with the fantastic Janie Chang, but I'm going to introduce her in 1 minute. First, I would like to acknowledge that I am broadcasting to you today from the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. As an uninvited guest that came here in 2014 as a refugee, and I arrived here, I would like to acknowledge the colonial impact of my participation in this, in coming here to Canada uninvited. And I also would like to acknowledge the wonderful, wonderful support and love that I've seen from every single Indigenous person on this land who welcomed me, showed me love, showed me support, and made me feel like I could, with their blessing, find a home for myself here. And today, I'm celebrating that. I'm celebrating the space that we're building here together by inviting the one and only Janie Chang. I have missed her so freaking much. You have no idea. The last time that I saw Janie Chang was actually in my wedding, almost a year, actually over a year ago. Yeah, she came to my wedding with 150 other people. So I barely saw any of those people. It was a very overwhelming day, to be honest. But I remember hugging her so closely, and I remember her taking videos of the belly dancers and the drag queens. It was a lot of fun to have you there. But today we're not here as friends. We are here because we are going to talk about some very interesting things about family dynamics and family history, and how we as writers infuse those family dynamics and family histories into our writing. But first things first, firstly, I would like to acknowledge the support from the Writers Union of Canada on providing us with the ability to make this happen. Thank you so much to the folks over there. And also, I would like to tell you a bit more about Janie Chang before I introduce her right here. So Janie Chang, she writes historical fiction that draws from family history and tales of ancestors who encountered dragons, ghosts, and immortals. Her novels, Three Souls and Dragon Springs Road, were nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award. Three Souls was also shortlisted for the 2014 BC Book Prizes Fiction Award. Now, both Dragon Springs Road and her latest book, The Library of Legends, were Globe and Mail bestsellers. She was born in Taiwan, yet she lived in the Philippines, in Iran, in Thailand, and New Zealand. And currently she lives in Vancouver with her husband and Micha, a rescue cat who thinks the staff could definitely do better. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Danny. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. I really, truly miss you. I'm so thankful I get this opportunity once a month to hang out with one of my dearest. So every month I hang out with one of my favorite people in the world, and then people come and watch us. And I'm so happy that you're my guest this month.
Yeah, so I'm going to warn all of the audience that when Danny and I start talking, we might be interrupting each other, talking over each other, because it could get pretty chatty.
Yes, yes, indeed. We both are very chatty people. I'll try my very best not to interrupt you because God knows you are a joy to listen to. But I'm hoping that we can have a conversation. And speaking of conversations, Janie, I have been wondering about the relationship between storytelling and family heritage. Throughout your career, in all of your books, you have navigated this relationship between oral history and the lines of storytelling in a written form. I also see a lot of interesting dynamics between factual history that you spend a lot of time researching and the mythological history infused in your narrative. How do you hold space in your fiction, in that narrative, for your family history, for the family histories that you are researching, but also for those many forms and styles of storytelling?
I think that different people are inspired by different things in their lives. And I've always been inspired by family stories. I came from, my dad's family has a recorded genealogy of 36 generations. And so he always used to tell me when I was a little girl, he would tell me stories about my ancestors. So I had an ancestor who saw a dragon, and the same ancestor walked through a gateway into the land of immortals and became an immortal. And I had another ancestor who, as a little boy, saw a ghost dancing across a roof, and that was an omen of death. So all of these things, I think, just sort of seep into your subconscious. And when you start writing, they can't help but come out because they have been meaningful to you all of your life. And yet they are also meaningful to the characters in your stories. You know, the mythology of China is a way, I think, of helping to understand the Chinese culture. As with any sort of folklore or mythology in any culture, helps you to understand the people and beliefs and belief systems. So I feel really, really fortunate that in addition to writing historical fiction, which, as you've said, requires a lot of research, trying to make sure you've got dates right, making sure that you have the context of some historical era correct, that you have characters who behave and respond to events consistent with someone of their class, of their wealth, of their education in that era. So not only all of that, but I feel really fortunate that I'm able to infuse, like drop in bits and pieces of my family history, because I think that adds more detail and authenticity and richness to the story. For myself, I just think that I did not appreciate what I had when I was younger. I wish I'd spent more time, you know, bugging my father to say, tell me more about your family, tell me more about what you remember. But honestly, it's, you know, only when you get older and these sources are leaving that you realize how valuable they are. So here's my big message to everyone who's listening, which is, please remember that oral history is so ephemeral. All it takes is for someone to die. All it takes is for someone to, I don't know, throw away some pictures. All it takes is for someone to decline into dementia and forget. And that very delicate chain of storytelling is gone. So what I did was, at one point, I asked my father just to talk into a tape recorder, back in the days of tape recorders. So you don't need to be a fantastic writer. You just need to take the time to listen to your elders, somehow document it, and preserve your stories.
I hear you. I hear you very well. Like, to be honest, so I'm working on a project, and it's part of it is memoir, and I'm thinking about this history, and I feel that there is a broken link between me and the history of my ancestors, because, you know, as a gay man, I got shunned away from my family, so I don't have the ability to pick up the phone and have a conversation, I don't know, with my grandmother and have this historical stories. So a lot of what I'm writing at the moment is about trying to guess and put the pieces together, trying to be like, well, the dates that I know would match with that part of the Syrian history. And I wonder, like, based on the political scene, the change in the society in Syria during the time that I'm thinking about, how would my family actually be? What kind of life they would hold? I think it requires not only, I think you do it so wonderfully because it requires not only the ability to connect with the heritage, but also it requires such a deep dive into research. And I saw you do your research. I remember once you showed me this document from this mill, like from this cotton mill or some sort of a like a beans
Yes.
mill of some
Oh
sort
my God, yes.
that you found that it was like in the 1920s or something. Can you tell me about that? Can you please remind me of that?
Well, so that's one of the examples where you do like this much research and you use about this much of it in the end, right?
Yeah.
So for my second book, Dragon Springs Road, the family that's in there, they own a cotton spinning mill. And at some point I found a scanned document of Shanghai, 1920s, and the number of cotton mills they had, right down to production output, which was like how many spindles of cotton were each of these factories producing. And I was so excited, you know, because it gave me insight into how people talked about how much cotton they were producing, you know. And by the time I finished editing and revising, that little jewel of information was thrown out, you know. But I'm going to say something here for people who say, well, you spent 6 months doing all the research and you didn't get to use it. Is it all wasted? Well, it's never wasted. It is totally never wasted, because another author, S.G. Wong, who writes detective stories, she said once, it's like making soup, you know. All this information goes in, and when you take it all out again, what you're left with is the broth. But the broth is everything that you understand now about it. And it seeps through all of your writing and it informs the way you write. So for example, I had said before, the way that a character responds to a situation will inform you of what are the social mores of the time, what is traditional versus radical, you know, what is that person's status in society. And unless you have that broth, you can't really come up with that authentic sort of a response to your character.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. That is really truly is, because I also think that when I'm writing, I'm specifically because I also write about historical Syrian events or events in Syria that are happening right now, but I don't have access to actually live them because I'm literally on the other side of the world, very extremely removed from those experiences. So I don't want to write a novel where I'm lecturing people about the historical accuracies as much as I want to show characters living in accurately in the history that I'm navigating. So it makes perfect sense to me. It does. It really does.
There is a real art. I mean, there's nothing worse than historical fiction that makes you feel like you're reading a textbook. Right.
100%.
So it is part of our obligation to make sure that it is through our characters and their dialogue and their responses and the way they treat the people around them. That is one part of informing readers what is normal life and what is an extraordinary life.
I agree. One last question before we move on to your reading. Do you think that your racial identity, as somebody who's coming from that part of the world, as somebody who carries that with them, does it inform your narrative as well? Do you think that there is a specific way of navigating your narrative with that racial identity as part of it?
You know what it makes me feel is that I have an advantage. it's really hard to describe, but I sort of have this sense of what would be accurate and what would not be accurate. So for my first novel, Three Souls, that was set during a time when my parents were children and adolescents. And therefore they had told me enough, and from what they told me, and about their families and their relationship with their servants, like family servants that had been working for the family for generations, versus that was really clear to me. But for my second book, which happened in maybe even 30 years before that, I got really nervous because I knew that enough social and political change had happened that people would not relate to each other in exactly the same way. That perhaps education for girls, for example, people's attitudes would have changed by then. Perhaps the way that you talk to a servant would have changed by then. Also, my parents' families were quite scholarly, and I was writing about a family that was of the merchant class, and that those that has a certain different sort of perspective on life. So I don't know if it means that if you, Danny, were to write a story about China and you did your research on 1920s, 1930s China, you would think, okay, 1908 China, I got that too. But actually not true, right?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I completely agree with that. I think that's something that a lot of authors, because there's like, from my perspective, there's a lot of authors out there who are dying to write the Syrian refugee experience. You see a lot of nonfiction, you see a lot of memoirs of the people who, I don't know, go to Turkey for 3 months and write about their experience over there. And it feels weird because it feels like I'm an animal in a zoo and somebody is like coming in to watch me, pet me on the head, and then go and write a scholarly piece about me. And B, it feels weird because there is certain perspective of how the community functions that it feels almost hereditary in a way. Like it's not something that I can explain to you. It is something that is within how I grew up, within how I was taught relationships work. I give an example once in an event, because somebody asked me about like cultural appropriation, and somebody was like, but like everybody should be able to write everything they wanted to. And I'm like, I agree with that. I think everybody should write everything they want to. I just think that there are things that no matter how deep you went in a dive to understand somebody else's culture, you're not going to catch. Like, for example, in English, when something warms your heart, when something makes you happy, it warms your heart. In Arabic, when something makes you happy, it ices your chest. It's not something that you will catch right away, but like, think about it for a sec. English is a language born in a cold part of the world, so warmth brings joy. While Arabic is a language born in a desert, so chillness, cold, is what brings joy. You see what I mean?
Yeah, and yet you as an author, because of the use of language, you need to somehow make the reader understand that a chill on the chest is actually a positive thing, So maybe say it, it made her feel as though a cool breeze was refreshing her heart or something. So you need to cast it in a way that's true to the Syrian, the Arabic saying, but also, understood as positive by your English Western reader, right? So
that's the thing. Yeah, it's definitely, it's on my list of questions when we talk later after the reading, on who are we writing for. So we are going to go there. But first, I would love to hear you read. I think it's time for folks to hear you read from the Library of Legends. I have to admit, I haven't finished it yet. I'm midway through, but
You should never confess that. Danny, you should just fake it.
No, I don't fake it. This is not the kind of panel where people fake it. We just tell the truth as is. However, you know that I read it's right here on my favorite books shelf. I read Dragon Springs Road. It was one of my favorite reads in 2018. I read Three Souls. It was such a fantastic read as well. So I cannot wait to hear you read from the Library of Legends. And I'm going to mute myself right now. So the stage will be yours. And then when you're done, I'll return to you. Okay?
Sure.
I'll leave you folks with Janie.
It turns out that the reading I've prepared begins and ends with poetry. I used lines from a poem as the epigraph of the novel I want to read it because I've had so many people respond to it. The Library of Legends came out when the COVID lockdown began in BC, and this is a 1,200-year-old poem that still applies because it echoes our worries about the uncertainties of life. Though the country is broken, hills and streams endure, and in the city spring comes again to trees and grasses. But flowers shed fearful tears, and desolate birds sing the sorrows of parting. Beacon fires have burned for 3 months now, and letters from home are worth 10,000 pieces of gold. And this is from a poem called Spring View by a poet called Du Fu, who lived during the Tang Dynasty, 712 to 770. So 1,200 years ago, and we can still feel it in our hearts when we read this. And now I'm going to read you a scene from the novel. And just so you know, the Library of Legends is set in 1937 China, when war breaks out between China and Japan. And universities have to evacuate for safety to the interior of China, and this means there are students and professors and servants. They begin a 1,000-mile journey, sometimes walking all the way, and they carry their belongings and school supplies and kitchenware and wheelbarrows and, and most importantly for this book, they carry with them the Library of Legends, a priceless ancient collection of Chinese myths. And in this scene, the students are on the road, which they share with other refugees. They're refugees in their own country. They're heading west towards safety, traveling in a caravan of carts and wheelbarrows, carrying their belongings on their backs. But enemy planes are an ever-present danger. And my main character, Leanne, a young woman, she can now hear a plane coming toward them. Leanne raced for the fields, rucksack bouncing on her back, frozen feet slipping down the embankment. She fell face down, hard-packed earth slamming the breath out of her. "Here, let me help you up," a male voice said. Still gasping for air, Leanne looked up. Shao smiled down at her. Behind him, the servant they called Sparrow scanned the sky, one hand shading her eyes as she squinted toward the horizon. Shao pulled Leanne to her feet and practically lifted her into the field. He set her down beside an irrigation ditch. Dry stems of wheat prickled her backside and stabbed at her hands. "We'll be safe here," Sparrow said. She had a quiet voice, but Leanne could hear it very clearly despite the approaching rumble. It was sweetly pitched and cut through the ominous roar. It was the voice of someone Leanne felt she could trust. "Into the ditch, please," Shao said, as calmly as if they were entering a classroom. Obediently, she rolled into the trench. Other students were already there, crouched with knees tucked, faces turned to the sky. Shao flashed a bright smile at Leanne again. Even though his school uniform was covered in dust, it was evident that Shao's jacket was beautifully tailored. Cuffs of fine cream-colored wool cloth peeked out from the jacket's sleeves. He radiated wealth and confidence, as if he were only sitting in the trench to keep her company, as if tragedy had never touched him and never would. Everyone had fallen silent, as if they could hide behind silence. The reverberating drone turned into a roar. Leanne squeezed her eyes shut at the sharp, rapid reports that could have been strings of firecrackers going off. but these were not the cheerful percussive snaps heard on the streets during New Year's. Then it stopped, the roar of engines faded slowly, and then the skies were quiet. Leanne opened her eyes as voices called out, the shouts of families trying to find each other. "Thank you for getting me off the road," she said, turning to Shao and Sparrow. But Shao was already out of the ditch, jogging across the field toward the road. Sparrow had also climbed out and put a hand down to help Leanne. She was slightly shorter, slightly thinner than Leanne, and in that moment, her eyes bright, cheeks flushed pink from excitement, Sparrow looked almost pretty. Leanne wondered if anyone ever looked past the servant to see the girl. Did Shao ever look? Sparrow scrambled up the embankment and onto the road. She bent down to help an old woman collect food that had rolled out of a basket. And for a moment, instead of Sparrow's waifish features, Leanne saw an exquisitely beautiful young woman, a woman whose figure gleamed with a faint and barely perceptible glow. Something prickled at the back of Leanne's memory, something from a dream. Then the layer of clouds shifted and sunrise once again flooded the landscape. Leanne blinked and all she saw was Sparrow, a perfectly ordinary servant girl who was running as if something terrible had happened. The road beyond the last cart was pockmarked with bullet holes. The small stone bridge had been strafed. Students stood in a circle, some staring down, others looking away. Gaps between their legs revealed a figure lying still on the ground. A dark blue uniform tunic and trousers, black shoes, a smear of blood. Before Leanne could get much closer, someone stepped in front of her. "You don't need to see this," Shao said, gripping Leanne's shoulder. "It's Mr. Shen. He's dead." Shen, their teaching assistant. The victims they had seen on the road a few hours ago had been nameless and faceless, but now the dead had a name. Shen had been one of their own. The circle of students parted as Professor Kang arrived, bringing with him two of the university's laborers. The two men wrapped Shen's body in a tarp, then lifted the bundle onto a handcart. They began pushing it up the road to join the caravan, which was now moving slowly. The professor said something to Sparrow, who'd been standing to one side, not joining in, not moving. She nodded and walked away. "We'll be at the monastery very soon," Professor Kang said to them all. "I'll ask the monks to look after the burial." Sparrow returned carrying a small chalkboard with ropes looped through holes at the corners. Professor Kang knelt on the ground to write, his strokes quick and precise. The poem. "Though rainfall bends the river grass, a bird is singing, while ghosts of the 6 dynasties pass like a dream around the forbidden city, under weeping willows which bloom for 3 miles along the misty moat." Now those lines are from A Nanking Landscape by the Tang Dynasty poet Wei Zhuang, he said. "Learn it by heart and consider its meaning. When you write your essays, remember the politics of his time." He put his arms through the ropes and shouldered the chalkboard. They continued their journey, the elderly professor walking in front of his students, the day's lesson hanging down his back.
I loved it. I loved it so much. I really did. I thought there's beauty and calmness in the way that you're right, even when you're writing about something as horrific as finding the body of somebody that they knew. It is almost smooth to hear. It's almost like it's beautiful in its tragedy. I love that about your writing. I really do.
It was actually really, really hard writing this book, Danny, because war is brutal. What can you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I was so worried about writing something that was going to turn people off, make them turn their eyes away, and yet to be truthful about how horrible it was. You know, the refugee experience of being torn away from your home, of the responsibility of carrying such a legacy of
Mm-hmm.
Chinese culture on your backs, you know.
Mm-hmm. 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 And I think the way that you approached it is quite effectful, to be honest, because um, the idea that you brought it from the perspective of this tiny little task that they carried, that slowly but surely they started to reveal to themselves how important it is. I remember in one of the scenes they're talking about how maybe it's not that big of a deal, and bickering about, like, is it a big deal or not to carry this library of legends with us. And it's such an impactful scene to see how they're gaining recognition for their own heritage, even when they're on the road escaping from a war that is destroying the country that they considered home. They called home all of their life.
Well, and when you talk about real historical fact, I suppose you also know that there was a real library. It wasn't called the Library of Legends, but there was a real library that one of the universities carried with them to safety. And it was actually far worse than in the story, because they had 230 crates of books to carry. So you can imagine how much that slowed them down while they themselves were trying to get to safety. And these books were saved because the students and the university were determined not to let this treasure be destroyed.
I feel like I'm going to sound like I am 8 years old, but I would say people these days are not going to carry books across borders. I'm never going to do that. Anyway, let me take you back to Michael V. Smith is here. He sends his love and he says that he loves that story. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I love Michael.
Well, and also if you go to my blog on janiechang.com, there's a blog there from, I don't know, back in July 5th or something. I wrote an article for Time magazine about the real library that was carried. So there's a link to the Time magazine article. So just go to janiechang.com, click on blog, or maybe it's on the front page of my website still, because there's a bunch of blogs at the bottom of the page, but you will learn about that it was a true story. And back again to family history, Danny, my father and my uncle were two students who actually fled with their universities. They were refugees in their own countries. They walked 1,000 miles to safety. They were cut off from their families. And the real university that carried the real library, they were on the road for almost 2 years before they ended up at their sort of interim wartime campus, you know, because they would stop somewhere for 3 or 4 weeks or a few months when they thought they were safe and continue on with their lessons and try and continue with their education. You know.
That's stunning. That is such a stunning piece of history that I'm so happy people get to read and learn about, either through the post that you mentioned on your blog or through the book that's trying to tell a fictionalized version of that. I have a story for you actually about your fiction. So there's always a supernatural element in that, be it 3 bickering souls in the 3 souls, they're fighting and they're revisiting history, be it foxes, the spirit of foxes turning to women and having conversations with the main characters in Dragon Springs Road, or even this this book
Edward.
with, yes, Edward just posted the link. Thank you, Edward. Even this book with the weight of the myths and the way you integrated that into your narrative. I noticed those supernatural elements walking in and out of your fiction, while also you're holding space for that accurate historical narrative. How do you choose for those elements to integrate into your fiction? And how do you balance between that accuracy on one side and that deep interest that you have for accuracy, while also bringing the spiritual storytelling that's not the biggest when it comes to accuracy?
So Danny, I know that both you and I have been told that our stories are, what's the word? Not surreal, magical realism.
Yes.
You know? So I would push back on that, because to me, magical realism is something, you know, in like Water for Chocolate, where the woman cries as she's making the food. So when people eat the food, they are filled with indescribable sadness, and they also cry. That's something that the author made up. Whereas all of my supernatural elements are from Chinese belief systems. So to me, that is authentic. And actually, someone once asked me, like, do you find it harder to create your characters to be realistic to that era? And you must feel so liberated when you're writing about your magical characters. And actually, not really, because I research a lot about the supernatural characters, because I also want them to be consistent with the canon of folklore, right? I mean, so the lucky thing is that with any myth, you can find 14 different versions of it, right? So you can pick one that suits your story better. But I have never used any supernatural characters, elements that would not have been familiar to the human characters in the novel, so that when they encounter the supernatural, the characters already know what it is that they're seeing. They understand what it is that they are seeing, what they're talking to. They understand the qualities of these supernatural beings. So both in terms of historical fiction and mythology, traditions of mythology, I try to be accurate. And for the sake of my characters, I try to be accurate about the supernatural.
And yeah, like you're writing from a culture, you're writing from a place where those characters believe in those supernatural beings, and they understand the rules and regulations of the supernatural world. So it makes sense that you would need to integrate this and that. And you use the term magic realism, and I roll my eyes so hard when people say it is the freaking worst. I hate that term. I find it's the way that white people are trying to understand people who write from their heritage, like yourself and mine. It is. I guess it's beautiful when you're talking about, I don't know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but that's because Marquez also would be writing a story, and in the middle of the story, the woman, while doing her laundry, angels would come down and snatch her to the sky. Like, yeah, that's sure. That is literally magic realism. But a lot of my writing, when it comes to the supernatural elements, is something that is not an attempt to write magic realism, but rather it's an answer to the way my society, how I grew up, understands the word. Because we don't just see the word as this scientifically proven narrative. It's not about what we can touch and we can see and we can hear. It's also about how our heritage has been built through legends and beliefs and traditions that lasted for thousands of years. Like, for example, if you are a child in Syria and you have a very bad dream, you would wake up with a bad dream, you'll go to your parents being like, I have a bad dream, and they will get you a little bowl of water, and the bowl is made of a certain kind of iron, a certain metal, but also it would have a lot of writing inside of the bowl. The writing is usually Quranic words. And then they fill it with water, you drink from it, it brings you the calmness, it makes you happy because it is now holy water of some sort. And I researched that for a short story that I was writing. It has been a thing since when Syrians were Assyrians. It has been a thing for 7,000-8,000 years when the goddess of the moon, her name is Nanar, the goddess of the moon, would protect children from nightmares, and you would, for her blessing to come to children, you would bring the little bowl with prayers to Nanar written inside. you'll drink from it, and it brings you that calmness. So we have had this for 8,000 years, 7,000 years, this kind of practice. And when I write something like Nanar is coming in and taking care of the child because the child is having a bad dream, I'm not trying to be magic realist. I'm truly telling the story of the way that my culture navigates things.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
I get you. I so get you.
All right. So still talking about metaphors and magic and including all of those together, I actually would like to ask you about your metaphors. So the thing that strikes me the most about every writer is their ability to bring such beautiful metaphors and mix them together with their narrative. It is vivid. Your metaphor is usually vivid. It's very, I would say it plays really well on the balance of being super well detailed and provide you with a complete scene, but also it's vivid with color and smell and touch, and it gives you a full picture in a way. So in a metaphorical sense, your writing carries all of that weight with it. But then can you tell me about your metaphors? Where do you find your metaphors as a writer, and how do you think of them?
Of course, with every book, it's different. And so let's talk about the Library of Legends, because quite honestly, when I began writing this book, there was no library in it. It wasn't until I'd done my research and came across the memoirs from the alumni of this university, and they're going, oh, and by the way, we carry this library with us, you know? and I'm looking at this, and as authors, we're looking at this going, holy freaking Christ, we've got like a library, that needs to be saved. And that itself is so symbolic. There's so much metaphor right there. And it was something that I could use throughout the story because it's being carried to safety throughout the story. And it stands for culture, it stands for knowledge, it stands for legacy, it stands for, a way of life. And then from there, because all the stories, it's like an encyclopedia of the mythology of China. And from there, each of the myths are also coming to life. And this metaphor there is that they're all leaving. They're on a parallel evacuation out of China because, as we all know, after the Second World War, China was never the same. So it was like, it was a way of life that was also leaving our mortal world, right? So I was really lucky to have stumbled across that going, gotta use this. And it was actually, I think I mentioned before that it was hard writing this book because it was so brutal, because it was war. And having the Library of Legends actually also really helped, because it meant that whenever I wrote about the creatures of the supernatural showing themselves, it meant that I could write using more beautiful prose than writing about the horrors of war. And I felt that it gave me a break, it gave the reader a break. So
I hear you. It's really interesting because for me, to be honest, when I'm writing, so when I wrote the Foghorn Echoes, I think of my metaphors as this body of water. I think of them that they need to belong to the same word in a way because they're telling one story. So for example, I wouldn't be able to write on one page a metaphor, a specific like detailed metaphor about like, I don't know, the sea or the waves of the sea. And then on the next page, I'll be writing about, I don't know, alien abduction. It just doesn't work. You know what I mean? So while I was writing the Foghorn Echoes, I used echo as a way of thinking of metaphors and where would I get metaphors from? And I used voice and sound and the way it vibrates often on other areas around it, and how it functions over water and how it functions over land and how it reflects back. And I thought about all of those things, and this was the space that I brought my metaphors from. This was the space that I brought my whether the way that I wrote the book because I have two characters in the Foghorn Echoes, and in a way they're echoing each other, and
Mhm.
they go back, like they go back and forth. The one chapter is set in Vancouver, the other chapter in Damascus, and so back and so on and so forth. Um, so the engine of the book itself is an echo, but also the metaphors within the book itself are all about like echoing. Yes. Yeah.
Well, Danny, you're being much more nuanced than I am. I just kind of slammed those supernatural characters in there.
I mean, it's working though. It's always fantastic. It really is. Um, I have two more. Oh, well, I have one question that I told you that I'm going to ask, but then I have a question that I thought about earlier today, which is also another thing that we have in common. So I'm sorry for going off script, but can you tell me about how you released the book during the 2020 pandemic? How was the book tour like? How
You're,
great that
you
was.
know, if I had more time, I would have pulled up this trade show banner that the marketing people at my publishers had made up for me, and they shipped it to me in like February, and then for all the book tours, and then of course there were no book tours. So I have this beautiful banner sitting in this black bag in the corner of my office. I had to really think through
Mhm,
how to do things virtually, because I mean, back then people were just starting to use Zoom, right?
mhm, mhm.
And we really didn't know, I don't know, what would be effective. And now everybody's just going, oh yeah, we'll do this virtual event. And bookstores have opened up again. So I've seen friends who've had their book launches at bookstores, but like only 3 people go in at a time and do their book signing, and
Mhm, mhm,
or they have a bunch of friends on a panel and they talk about the book together. I think it's always nicer to have someone else with you so that you're not the only talking head there. It's
mhm,
nice,
mhm.
yeah. So, but I really believe that bookstores and libraries and literary events have, really worked hard to make sure that we could get some visibility. Some,
Mhm, mhm.
it's
I
so
feel
there's
the
been
same
the
way.
bad,
Yeah.
yeah. But the good
Yeah.
part is we're not limited by geography anymore. Someone in a small town in the middle of the prairies can dial into this just as easily as someone in Toronto or Vancouver.
I completely agree. And like I had the same experience because Salma the Syrian Chef, my children's book, came out March 8th.
Ah, mhm.
Saha, bless you. Oh, Christine Burns says that she's listening from South Korea.
Oh
So
my
that's
goodness,
amazing.
it's amazing.
That is amazing. Hi, Christine. Thank you for listening from South Korea. So yeah, like I had the Salman Sian Chef, my children's book, coming out on March 8th in Vancouver, shut
Yeah,
down on March 10th. So it wasn't the best of time to release the book, I have to say. And we, like, between Anik Press, my publisher, who did a lot of freaking work to
mhm.
switch it into virtual, and all the different organizations and festivals who did the work, um, they did a fantastic job, I think. But what this actually opened my eyes to is the possibility for the future after COVID is done.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think like authors being invited to events, like going to festivals and going for book readings, the minute that this is over, is going to go back, because there is something to be said about having the author right there in front of people, reading from their book, signing their copies. There's
mhm.
something to be had. That's a unique experience that I think 100% will be returning after COVID-19. But also there's something to be said about, like, I don't know, from now on, a school in Nevada might be interested in having me over to read from Salma the Syrian Chef, and they don't need to fly me anymore. And
That's
that
right.
they can just like have me on Zoom and have a conversation like this one. And I think that in a way I'm very optimistic about this change, because it means that we can have the best of both worlds, I guess.
I believe that's absolutely true, especially now that the reading audience is really used to these virtual events. So Hey, I want to say something else to you, Danny, which is,
Yeah.
no, you never got around to like beta reading my book, but I forgive you. But,
Okay. Thank you.
but I also wanted to tell you that when I was writing about it, I know that my friendship with you made me look deeper into the experience of being a refugee. Not
Oh.
that I could know anything about what you went through and that I could relate really to what my father told me, but I was looking at what really struck me was how when people are torn away from their home, that it's also their identity, that they are losing that whole neighborhood, that whole community that used to know them. And I mean, you were a journalist and you weren't allowed to be that. You just got slapped with the label of refugee as though you never were anything else, right? And I tried to work some of that into the story, even though it was slightly different because these were refugees in their own country. But yet, home meant so much back then, so much more back then.
Of course, I completely agree. And I thank you. I thank you. That makes me feel quite proud. Thank you very much for pointing that out. You're making me red in the face. Don't do this to me. Last question, and then I have to ask you for another reading.
Okay.
Who do you write for? Do you write for yourself? Do you write for a specific audience? Do you have a specific identity you think that you're communicating with? Is there some sort of a negotiation that happens during your process of writing based on who you assume will read you?
You know, I think first of all, I write for myself. It has to be something that's interesting enough, because otherwise, how do you get through 100,000 words in like a year and a half? It's got to be something that really tugs at your heartstrings, that you're passionate about, that you really want other people to understand. So that's the first requirement. But then I sometimes think that the person that I'm writing for is someone else kind of like me, who grew up in a Western culture with some inkling, okay, I have better than an inkling, but some idea of what Chinese culture is about. Because I think that of all the emails that make me happiest are the ones from other Chinese Canadians or Chinese Americans who say, wow, I never knew anything about what it was like. My parents never said very much about their home and their families. And I think that those are the emails that really move me. And then there's also the Western audience, the ones where, you know, you're always thinking to yourself, they don't understand anything about Chinese culture. How can I convey it without making it sound like a social studies lesson?
100%. I have so much to say about this, but it also falls in the same depth that you said, and I feel like you said it all wonderfully. So, and we have like a good 5 minutes, so I'm gonna ask you for a short reading, and then yeah, let's go for it. Let's do a short reading. Yeah.
It is a very short reading. We talked about the elements of fantasy in the Library of Legends, because as the students evacuate to safer territories away from the war zone, the supernatural beings described in the priceless books they carry are also on a parallel exodus. And at this point in the book, the main character, Leanne, has seen some of this, but she's kind of managed to tell herself that she was dreaming, you know. But here, she and her travel companions are on a mission of their own. They've broken away from the rest of the university, and they're staying at an inn, and she can't sleep. The inn and the forest around it were so quiet, Leanne could hear the faintest of breezes rustling through bamboo. It was no use. She couldn't get back to sleep. And Sparrow was gone. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, Leanne went outside to the yard. Sparrow sat at one of the tables, her face turned up to the sky. When she saw Leanne, she pulled out one of the stools. Leanne sat down with a sigh. My mind is so restless, she said in reply to Sparrow's inquiring look. Beyond getting back to Shanghai and asking Xiao's father to help us, I don't have a plan. I don't know where to begin looking for my mother. I don't even have a place to live. Well, there's more than enough room at the Liu estate, Sparrow said. They'd be happy to have you as a guest. To live in the same house as Shao, their budding yet undefined relationship, the scrutiny of his wealthy family and their servants? Leanne shrank at the thought. And for how long could she impose on them? Well, my mother's probably found some place to live by now, she said. Then she noticed Sparrow wasn't paying attention. The servant girl's head was cocked to one side as though listening. A moment later, Leanne heard it too, the sound of hoofs, but not the heavy clopping of horses or donkeys. Something lighter and quicker was cantering toward them, not just one, a herd. When she saw them, Leanne gasped. Sparrow put out a warning hand to her. Hush, she said, Qiling unicorns. They were dainty creatures, their deer-like bodies lithe and sleek, manes fluttering bright as flames along their necks. The Qiling slowed to a trot, their long tufted tails curved proudly over their backs. Their leader, a black Qiling, paused and the herd stopped. The black Qiling lifted one hoof, the single antler at the center of its forehead burnished by moonlight. It tipped its head toward the table. Sparrow stood and bowed in response. The leader delicately sniffed the night air, then lashed its tail as if making a decision. Then the black Qiling leapt into the forest and the herd followed, sprinting through the undergrowth. A moment later, the road was empty. But in the wake of their passage, trembling limbs of dogwood and rhododendron put out their first blooms. Forsythia shrubs sprouted gold blossoms, and white mist poppies pushed tendrils of green above the ground. Leanne could see all this because the yard was illuminated by a soft glow, and this time Leanne knew she was awake. And she knew also that she'd been awake all those other times when she had seen Sparrow shining in the dark. Sparrow, who was not a servant. Sparrow, whose exquisitely beautiful features smiled at her. Sparrow, who was the willow star. How could she not have seen?
People are saying beautiful, saying, wow, it is a moment. It is a beautiful, stunning moment of reveal. I mean, also those deer-like unicorns are so beautifully described. That moment is so, so stunning. So thank you so much for sharing it. People over here are saying, wow, beautiful. Michael V. Smith is saying he got chills all over. It is wonderful to hear your read, my friend. Thank you so much for today. That brings us to the end of this beautiful hour. Thank you so much for joining me today, Janie Chang. You were so beautiful. You were so amazing, so articulate. I live for this kind of conversation. I'm so happy I get to host you.
And I look forward to the day we can have a dinner party together again.
Yes, yes, I want that dinner party. I'm going to bring Matthew. I'm going to bring some other friends, and we're going to throw a dinner party at your home.
Absolutely. So
awesome.
Thank you for inviting me. This was so much fun. We knew it was going to be fun.
Yes, we did. Yes. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for that for folks who came in today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for cheering me and Janie Chang on. I really appreciate it. Next month, actually, it's like in 3 weeks from now, we have Michael V. Smith as our guest for I Have Been Wondering. Michael has been coming every single month to this event and has been so freaking supportive. So I cannot wait to have you folks see the work that he does, see the work that he's going to bring to us. It is going to be fantastic. I also want to say that January is with Farzana Doctor, who just released her book 7. February is with Larissa Lai and her beautiful book, The Tiger Flew. It is a packed, amazing series of work that we have. It has been amazing to be able to host these folks. And thank you so much for everybody who's saying wonderful things on the chat. Thank you again, Janie. And on this note, good night.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.